Aisha Malik kept a small,
stubborn optimism about the world. At 22, she had learned the practicalities of life: how to budget a week's groceries, how to fix a leaking tap, how to speak politely to relatives who asked unending questions about marriage. She studied sociology at a local university and worked part-time at a community library. Books were her refuge, their ordered pages, certain words to explain human behavior, the comfort of stories where things resolved, if not perfectly, then with truth. She lived in a rented room above her aunt's shop. The neighborhood was noisy at times, full of chai sellers and scooters and the bright, domestic chaos of a working-class lane. Yet the street had its own gentleness, neighbors who kept an eye on one another's children, a grocer who saved fruit for Aisha when she came late from the library. She knew the sounds of late evenings, the clatter of dishes, the distant television dramas, the hum of people moving through their own small tasks. The night before the incident was ordinary in that way. Aisha had stayed late finishing an assignment on social safety nets. Her friend Sana called. They joked about an upcoming seminar. When she walked home, the air had been warm and fragrant with jasmine from a neighbor's balcony. She waved at the night guard and let herself into the narrow stairs of the building that had become, for her, a modest bookmark in the city. There were small things about that night she could later list with the precision habitual to survivors: the bright neon of a sign that flashed in front of the chai shop, the way the front of her phone screen had a faint crack where it had fallen weeks earlier, the yellow taxi that paused at the corner twice as a couple arguing spilled onto the pavement. None of the small things suggested danger. Danger, as she would come to learn, did not always announce itself with thunder. It sometimes hid behind a smile, a promise, the polite insistence of someone with power or familiarity.
When it was over, the men left as if nothing had happened, their words casual as they closed the car door behind them. Aisha sat on the curb, the city lights around her hazy and indifferent. Nobody came to offer help. People moving down the lane assumed she was drunk, tired, or sleeping. She had a phone, but her hands shook too much to dial. Her first thought, oddly, was not only of herself but of who would believe her story. She had been raised to resolve conflict quietly, to avoid raising shame. The memory of the encounter stuck to her like a shadow, a voice that had once promised help becoming the instrument of harm. That night she walked home slowly, each step heavy. She did not sleep. She sat with the silence until dawn and the street started to smell like frying onions and bread. When she finally told her aunt and Sana the words, they did not fit into any neat category. The world that had been ordinary split. She learned the particular loneliness of those who have had their experience sanctified only by the courage it takes to speak about it. When Aisha first spoke of the attack, the words came out in fits, a stuttering of facts, location, approximate time, the faces that remained in the edges of her memory. Her aunt listened first, the woman's face folding into worry and anger in quick succession. Then Sana, who arrived carrying a thermos and an aura of furious protectiveness. The immediate aftermath had a chaotic clarity, phone calls that blurred into one another, the distant, perfunctory kindness of neighbors who opened their doors and tried to make tea. Sana holding Aisha's hands as if to reassure that she existed, that the body that had been violated was still hers. But trauma is not a single event. It is a folding of time that keeps unraveling. Aisha slept in fits. She woke to small triggers, the sound of a car door slamming, an old ringtone, a man's casual laughter across a restaurant, and found herself back in the curbside lane. Food went untasted, books she had loved felt thin and irrelevant. At the university she tried to sit through lectures, but a dozen ordinary things, the phraseology a professor used, a reference to community safety, could set off an avalanche of nausea. The decision to report the assault to the police came not from courage alone but from slow, weary accumulation. The knowledge that the same man might harm someone else. The anger that boiled under her skin. The sense that to be silent was to be complicit in a system that allowed predators to move freely. Her aunt sat quietly beside her as Aisha wrote down the details in the police station. The officer who received her was not as brusque as she feared. He took notes and asked questions with a practiced neutrality. He told her the next steps, what evidence would be useful, how the forensic process would work. The words were clinical, names, dates, procedures, but they grounded her in a thin rope of action. For a few hours, action cut through the fog. Then the social world reasserted itself in less helpful forms. News travels quickly in close-knit neighborhoods. Messages arrived with the awkward care of people who don't know how to support a survivor. Some asked private questions. Why did you go with them? Were you drinking? Some extended sympathy and immediately tempered it with suggestions. You should forget and move on. At the university, gossip hummed like an insect at the edge of every gathering. Aisha felt herself become an object of whispers, a moral question to be debated in hushed tones. She learned that people's empathy often coexists with suspicion. Some friends retreated awkwardly, afraid of the perceived stain. Within herself she felt estranged. Aisha would catch herself replaying the moment of trust when she had stepped into the car, then dissecting every micro-decision as if any one of them could be replaced to prevent the outcome. This self-scrutiny was a private cruelty. Recovery experts later would call it self-blame, a common and understandable reaction. But at the time it read like a ledger in which every trivial choice was marked as debt. The legal process moved at its own rhythm. Investigations, forensic appointments, and the time-consuming bureaucracy of statements and verification. Each step required Aisha to retell the story, sometimes in rooms of strangers whose presence was required for the machinery of justice. Each retelling was a small reopening. It was a strange paradox, to be both believed by the system and simultaneously forced to relive the harm in exacting, technical detail. The forensic nurses were kind. The social worker assigned to her provided pamphlets about counseling and the rights of survivors. They spoke in the language of procedures that was both comforting and alien.
Counseling began haltingly. At first Aisha believed the therapist's questions were impossible to answer. How does this make you feel? She could only identify a few adjectives: raw, empty, ashamed, but as weeks became months, therapy helped her map the rhythms of panic and the contours of resilience. The therapist taught her grounding techniques, focusing on breath, counting tiles on the floor, returning to the sensory present when a memory threatened to pull her away. These techniques were practical and unglamorous, but they offered small victories: a night slept without waking in terror, a walk taken without the panic that once accompanied any car door slamming nearby. There were also moments of solidarity that cut through the loneliness. Other survivors Aisha met through a support group shared their own messy, non-linear recoveries. They spoke frankly about anger and the pressure to present as fine, about the institutional obstacles they had faced and the subtle, cruel policing of their grief. In their stories, Aisha found recognition and companionship. The group's meetings were messy and human, tea spilled, laughter cracking into tears, stories that stitched over each other like hands joining. It was there she learned that recovery was not a destination but a practice daily, imperfect, and communal. Anger became a resource inside her, not the volatile, destructive anger people fear, but a focused energy that propelled her to take steps she might never have taken otherwise. She wrote op-eds for a local paper about survivor rights. She volunteered at the community library's late hours program, advocating with more intensity for safety measures, better street lighting, emergency contact points, awareness sessions. She slowly transformed the violation into a call for change. This didn't erase the pain. The nights of cold anxiety persisted, but it allowed her pain to be put into motion, to become something that could demand public attention and accountability. Even so, the world around her continued to be complicated. The accused denied the allegations, and community fault lines widened. Some acquaintances picked sides without hearing facts. Others offered Aisha quiet, unassuming presence. Through it all she learned to keep a smaller, more careful circle. It was a painful education, but one that taught her where to conserve vulnerability and where to preserve it for people who could hold it kindly.
As the investigation progressed, the faces of those involved became entangled in a public choreography that neither Aisha nor her supporters had asked for. The accused hired a lawyer. There were pressures, both subtle and overt, to settle or to withdraw. Rumors hardened into apparent certainties for neighbors who wanted clear narratives. For Aisha, the case was not merely a legal test but an ethical gauntlet. How much of her life would she place in evidence to seek justice? How much pain was she willing to live through for accountability? The courtroom, when proceedings began, felt like a small theater of power. It maintained its own rhythm. the deliberate thud of gavel, the dry voice of the judge, the formal cadence of lawyers. Her statement in court was an act of tremendous concentration. She spoke plainly, refusing to collapse her experience into spectacle. She insisted on the truth of what had happened without elaborate dramatics. Friends and family filled to rows in the gallery. Sana sat beside her like a steady rock, squeezing Aisha's hand when the weight of the moment felt unbearable. Outside the courtroom, phrases circulated. Be brave, keep strong, don't show weakness. The concept of bravery suddenly felt codified and narrow. Aisha learned that survival is not always bravery, a spectacle, but sometimes endurance and the quieter acts of getting through a routine day. Cross-examination was a different kind of violence. The defense attorney's strategy relied on dissecting details, exploring inconsistencies in memory that trauma often causes, and raising questions about behavior and motive. They asked why she had not screamed, why she had stayed in the car, why she had not left her number with a neighbor. Each question was designed to cast doubt in public. The heat of embarrassment and the ache of reliving the experience were acute. On the stand, Aisha felt the weight of an entire social script that would work to rewrite her as unreliable. She had to find a voice that could persist under pressure, voice aided by the legal team and the counsel that prepared her for the anticipated lines of attack. Outside the legal arena, the community dynamic grew more complex. Some people rallied, organizing small vigils outside the courthouse to draw attention to the need for safety and to assert solidarity with survivors. Others quietly encouraged a reconciliation that would allow the accused to maintain reputation at the cost of public consequence. It was a difficult moral landscape. Aisha learned that communities often prefer neat closure even when that closure requires silence about wrongdoing. She felt the pressure of being both a private person and a public actor. One of the hardest choices she faced was against a different kind of pressure, to forgive publicly and move on. Family members urged reconciliation as a way to avoid public scandal, arguing that a formal settlement could save everyone pain. Forgiveness, offered as a social balm, assumed an easier path than pursuing accountability. But Aisha's understanding of forgiveness was different. She had found, in therapy, that forgiveness is sometimes a private decision for one's own peace, not a social transaction bartered to save face. To forgive publicly would have felt like erasing the truths she had walked through. The trial ultimately forced a reckoning. Evidence was presented, witness statements about where the accused had been, a witness who had seen the car in that back lane, inconsistencies in the accused's account. The legal process is imperfect and often slow, but here the accumulation of testimony, the diligence of the investigating officers, and Aisha's willingness to persist created a firm scaffolding. The judge's eventual ruling, when it came, was not a bomb that erased the past. It was a formal recognition that a wrong had been committed and that the law acknowledged it. That recognition had material consequences: a sentence, a public record, a disruption to the accused's normal life. For Aisha, it was validation of a truth she had been forced to carry alone for so long. Even as the legal chapter closed, Aisha felt the aftershocks. People who had once been comfortable around her now hovered at a distance, unsure how to speak with someone who had been through such a trial. But there were also new alliances, NGOs that provided resources, friends who reached out with invitations to simple walks, a neighbor who began leaving a small plate of fruit outside Aisha's door without comment. These acts of ordinary kindness stitched new patterns of trust. In the months after the verdict, Aisha began to make concrete choices about her future. She resumed classes, though in a slower, more careful rhythm. She took on a volunteer role with a local helpline for survivors, not because she wanted to be defined by what had happened, but because she wanted to offer, to others, what had been so scarce for her in the early days: steady listening, information, the honest admission that recovery is uneven. Helping others gave her a direction, a sense that the pain could be transformed into collective action and support.
There were painful remnants, flashbacks that arrived with sudden intensity, the occasional hostile message from supporters of the accused, the daily labor of managing anxiety. But there were also growing strengths. She learned to ask for what she needed, time off when her mental health required it, the presence of a friend when a social event felt overwhelming. She practiced boundaries, declining invitations that drained her, Each small, self-respecting choice became a quiet reclamation of agency. At night, she sometimes still woke with the old fear in her body. But increasingly, those nocturnal moments were followed by grounding, counting breaths, naming objects in the room, reminding herself of where she was now. Her life was not what it had been before the assault, but it was not only defined by the violation. In the legal verdict, in the relationships she nurtured afterward, Aisha found a fragile but growing sense of self-determination. The road ahead remained long, but it now had signposts, advocacy, education, community work. She began to imagine a future beyond a single defining moment.